In a world of giants, it takes a special kind of strength to stand tall and be heard. Join us as we tell the epic stories of modern-day titans who fought for their dreams against impossible odds. Subscribe today and find the titan living within yourself.
I didn't scream. I didn't collapse. I just stood there in my kitchen, holding the phone against my ear, listening to my daughter cry on the other end of the line, and I felt nothing. That was the part that scared me most. Not the news itself, but the silence inside me where grief was supposed to be. My son-in-law had called me first. He said Marcus had been found unresponsive in his car, parked in the lot behind his office building. They said it was a heart attack. 41 years old, healthy, never smoked a day in his life, ran 5 miles every Saturday morning, and they said it was a heart attack. I said, "Okay." I hung up. Then I sat down at my kitchen table and stared at the wall for a very long time. I'm 63 years old. I spent 22 years working in insurance fraud investigation before I retired. I know what grief looks like when it hits clean and honest. I know what it looks like when something underneath it is wrong. That morning, sitting in my kitchen in Charlotte, North Carolina, I couldn't have told you which one I was feeling. But I knew they weren't the same thing. The funeral was on a Thursday. We buried Marcus in the cemetery off Lawyers Road, next to his father, who had passed 8 years before. My daughter stood beside the grave in a black dress I had never seen her wear, holding my 2 grandchildren by their hands. My son-in-law, her husband, Raymond, stood just slightly behind her, one hand on her shoulder. He wore a dark gray suit. His eyes were dry. I noticed that. I shouldn't say I judged it because people grieve in all kinds of ways, and I know that, but I noticed it. The way you notice a door that's slightly off its hinges. Nothing you can point to exactly, just a feeling that something isn't sitting right. We went back to my daughter's house afterward. People brought food. Someone put on coffee. The grandchildren, 6 and 8 years old, sat on the living room floor watching cartoons with the sound turned low, and I kept looking at them and thinking about how they were going to grow up without their uncle in the world. Marcus was my only son. He was the kind of man who remembered birthdays and called just to check in, who fixed things around my house without being asked, who never once in his adult life made me feel like a burden. He built his own accounting firm from nothing, starting with 1 office and 1 assistant, and by the time he died, he had 14 employees and clients across 3 states. Raymond had come to work for him 4 years ago. My daughter had introduced them. Raymond was a college friend of hers from years back. Fallen on hard times, needed a fresh start. Marcus had given him that start. A real salary, a real title, a real chance. I had always thought it was one of the finest things my son ever did. I thought about that, driving home from the funeral. About generosity, and what it costs, and whether the people who receive it always understand what it's worth. 3 days after we buried Marcus, my phone rang at 9:30 in the morning. I didn't recognize the number, but I answered it because I had been answering every call since his death, afraid to miss something important. The man on the other end introduced himself as Gerald. He said he owned the building where Marcus had rented office space for the past 6 years. He said he was sorry for my loss, that Marcus had been one of the finest tenants he'd ever had, always on time, always respectful, never any trouble. Then he paused, and his voice changed. He said, "Ma'am, I've been going back and forth about whether to make this call, but I don't think I can sit on this in good conscience. There's something in the office I think you need to see. I'd ask that you come alone. And I'd ask that you not mention it to your son-in-law." I remember the cold that moved through me when he said that. Not fear exactly. More like recognition, the feeling of a key turning in a lock you didn't know was there. I said, "I'll be there in an hour." Gerald met me at the side entrance of the building. A man in his late 60s with white hair and the kind of careful expression people wear when they're about to say something difficult. He shook my hand and led me upstairs without much conversation. Marcus's office was still as he'd left it. The police had been through it, but everything had been put back. It smelled like him. That was the thing that almost undid me. I hadn't expected that. Gerald walked to the large filing cabinet behind the desk. He opened the bottom drawer and lifted out a brown accordion folder, the kind with an elastic closure, thick with papers. He said Marcus had come to him about 2 weeks before he died, clearly distressed. He had asked Gerald if he could store something in the building's management office somewhere no one from his own company would ever have reason to go. Gerald had agreed without asking too many questions. He said Marcus had looked like a man who was carrying something very heavy. I sat down in my son's desk chair and opened the folder. It took me about 40 minutes to understand what I was looking at. I am not an accountant, but I spent 2 decades reading financial documents and looking for things that didn't belong. What was in that folder was a record careful, detailed, dated of money being moved out of Marcus's firm over a period of nearly 2 years, payments to shell vendors that didn't exist, reimbursements for expenses that were never incurred, a slow, steady leak, small enough in any given month to avoid triggering the firm's own internal alerts, large enough over time to add up to just under $300,000. At the back of the folder, Marcus had written a summary in his own handwriting. 4 pages, neat and precise. He had traced every transaction. He had identified the account the money was flowing into. The account belonged to Raymond. I sat very still for a long time after I read that. I thought about my daughter. I thought about the 2 grandchildren on the living room floor. I thought about Raymond standing at the graveside in his dark gray suit with his dry eyes. Then I thought about the timeline. Marcus had discovered this approximately 3 weeks before he died. He had hidden the evidence 2 weeks before he died. His heart attack, if it was a heart attack, had come 1 week after that. 41 years old. No history, no warning. I thanked Gerald. I took the folder. I drove home, and I sat at my kitchen table again. Same chair, same wall. But this time I was not empty. This time I was thinking very carefully. The first thing I did was call a woman I had worked with for many years, a former colleague who had gone on to become a forensic accountant. I told her I needed a professional review of some financial documents and that I needed it done quietly. She said she would come the next morning. The second thing I did was call my own attorney. The third thing I did, and I want to be clear about this, because I have heard the criticism, and I believe it is fair. The third thing I did was call the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department's non-emergency line and ask to speak with someone about a potential financial crime that may be connected to a recent death. I gave them Marcus's name. I gave them the case number from the original report. I told them I had documentation I wanted to submit. The detective I spoke to said she would follow up, and she did. She called me back the following afternoon. I tell you this because I know what the right thing to do was. I know I should have handed everything to the police and stepped back and let them do their work. I am 63 years old, and I have watched enough investigations go sideways to know that civilians inserting themselves into active situations rarely helps and sometimes makes things catastrophically worse. I know all of that, and I still made a mistake. But I made it with my eyes open, which I suppose is its own kind of choice. Here is what happened. About a week after I found the folder, Raymond called me. He said he was worried about me, that my daughter had mentioned I seemed distant. He said he wanted to stop by, check on me, maybe bring dinner. His voice was warm and familiar, the way it always was, and I understood in that moment exactly how he had managed to do what he did, not just to Marcus's firm, but to all of us. He was very, very good at sounding like someone who had nothing to hide. I said yes. Come at 6. I want to be honest about my reasoning, because looking back, I can see the shape of it clearly, and I can see where it bent. My attorney had advised me to avoid direct contact. The detective was moving, but slowly these things take time. Documentation has to be verified, warrants have to be obtained. I told myself I just wanted to watch him, to see if he would say anything, to have one conversation while I still could before everything became official and formal and out of my hands. What I did not do, and this is the part I regret most, was record it. I had a phone in my pocket with a perfectly functional voice memo application. I didn't turn it on. Part of me didn't want to believe, even then, that the conversation would be the kind that needed to be recorded. Part of me was still holding on to the small, stubborn hope that I had misread something, that there was an explanation I hadn't considered. There was no explanation. Raymond sat across from me at my kitchen table with a plate of food he'd brought from a restaurant. And he was pleasant and attentive for about 20 minutes. And then something shifted. I'm not sure what I said or how I said it. Some question about the firm, about the finances, about how the other employees were managing, but I watched his face change. Just slightly. Just enough. He said, "You've been talking to someone." I said, "Marcus talked to people all the time." That was the kind of man he was. And Raymond looked at me across my kitchen table, and for just a moment, the warmth was completely gone. What was underneath it was something flat and careful and entirely without feeling. He said, "I think we should be very careful, the two of us, about how we handle his estate, for the family's sake." I said, "I agree completely." He left at 8 o'clock. I locked the door behind him. I stood in my hallway and I breathed. Then I called my attorney and told her what had happened, and she told me, firmly and without any softening, that I was not to have any further direct contact with Raymond under any circumstances. She was right. I should have listened the first time. What happened over the next 3 weeks is difficult to describe in terms of pace. Investigations don't move the way they do in films. There is no single dramatic moment where everything breaks open at once. There is paperwork, and waiting, and careful telephone calls, and more waiting. My forensic accountant colleague submitted her professional analysis, which confirmed and expanded on everything Marcus had documented himself. The detective I'd been working with brought in a financial crimes unit. They obtained a warrant to examine the accounts Raymond had been directing the funds into. What they found was worse than what Marcus had documented, because Marcus hadn't had access to everything. The total amount Raymond had taken from the firm over 26 months was closer to $410,000. He had also, the investigators found, taken out 2 loans under the firm's name without Marcus's knowledge, small enough that they hadn't triggered automatic alerts, large enough to create real liability. And the account he'd been funneling money into had been making regular payments to a third party, an individual the financial crimes team identified as someone Raymond owed money to from years before he ever came to work for Marcus. Marcus had known about the embezzlement. What he may not have known, what the investigators were now working to establish, was the full extent of the pressure Raymond had been operating under. When a person owes a very large amount of money to a very dangerous person, and they are actively stealing from their employer to service that debt, and their employer discovers it, that is a situation with a particular kind of gravity, the kind that can move people to do things they would not otherwise do. I am not going to tell you the investigation concluded the way I wanted it to. The truth is that some things about Marcus's death remain, even now, officially unresolved. The medical examiner's findings were reviewed, but cardiac events are difficult to prove or disprove after the fact, especially when the person was not in a high-risk category, and there was no witness to whatever may have occurred in that car. What I can tell you is what did happen. Raymond was arrested and charged with multiple counts of wire fraud, embezzlement, and financial fraud against the firm. He was also charged with taking out fraudulent loans in the firm's name. The case went to trial. My daughter, who is one of the strongest people I have ever known, sat through every day of it. The jury deliberated for 2 days. They came back with guilty verdicts on all counts. Raymond was sentenced to 11 years. Is that justice? I don't know. I ask myself that question, and I don't know how to answer it. It is accountability. Which is not the same thing, but it is what the law provides. And I believe in the law even when it leaves gaps that nothing can fill. My daughter is doing the work of putting her life back together, one ordinary day at a time. My grandchildren are in counseling. They are funny and loud, and they make me laugh in ways I didn't expect to be able to laugh again. We don't talk about Raymond. We will someday, when they're old enough to ask questions and ready to hear answers. But not yet. I think about Marcus every morning. I think about the folder he put together so carefully, the handwriting so precise, the documentation so thorough, my son the accountant, doing what he did best even when everything was falling apart around him. He trusted the evidence. He gathered it, and he protected it, and he put it somewhere safe, because some part of him knew, I think, that someone would need it eventually. I think he meant for that someone to be the police, or his attorney, or someone professional who would know exactly what to do. Instead, it was his mother, 63 years old, sitting in his desk chair in his empty office, reading his handwriting and slowly understanding what he had been trying to tell us. I'm sorry I didn't do everything right. I'm sorry I sat across from that man at my kitchen table without recording a single word of it. I'm sorry for every moment I moved on instinct and impulse when I should have moved on protocol. I know better. I did it anyway, but I found the folder, and I didn't let it disappear. And when the right people finally had what they needed, they did their jobs. That's what I have. And on the mornings when it feels like it isn't enough, I go back to something simple, and I hold on to it. Marcus documented the truth because he believed someone would act on it. I acted on it, imperfectly and stubbornly, and with too much heart and not enough procedure. But I acted on it. For every mother who has ever looked at a story that was handed to her as a tragedy and felt, somewhere underneath the grief, that stubborn cold certainty that it was something else, I see you. Trust it. But please, please call the police first. Record everything. And don't sit across the table from a man like that without someone else in the room. I learned that the hard way, so you don't have to.